Let's move on now to Mark. We've heard from three pretty diverse on the ground experiences. Some sort of a mature organization pulling this in, and another really catalyzing its growth through grant. Why don't you give us introduce us to the evaluation you did, I believe, at the request of the SBA, which I think is interesting in itself. But why don't you kind of go over how a quite formal evaluation came to be done of a quite young, and ambitious program at the SBA, and give us a quick look at some of your top-line findings.
Okay. First, thank you for inviting me to be here. So I'll just quickly summarize some of our findings. We currently have our third-year evaluation in process. We're currently in the data collection phase. So the results that I'll discuss today are from our second-year findings. So our metrics cover a gambit of things that we think are relevant, both in the intermediate and then possibly for the short term. We started the evaluation a number of years ago, as I mentioned. We're looking at a number of different metrics, some dealing with the clusters themselves and their efficiency and how they approach using information, customizing, and serving the needs of the businesses that they're working with. And of course, we're doing work for SBA, so there's, of course, a strong emphasis and a primary emphasis on the small businesses that are participating. We have a number of different metrics. Looking at participation, the engagement of small businesses, the revenues that are coming in for the small businesses that are participating, employment, payroll, funding, external funding, industry engagement, and patents, and things of that nature. So, of course, you have to remember the context that we were in when this funding started. We were in the midst of an economic recession, the Great Recession. And so during that same time period, there was lethargic economic growth. And so just to talk just very briefly about the efficiency of clusters. Of course, we were looking at 10 clusters spread across the country. The mature clusters, those were 4 years and older, they spent about 84% of the money they received from SBA on providing services to businesses, as opposed to administrative cost. The less mature were spending a little bit less, but they showed significant improvements in their efficiency metrics over the first 2 years. With respect to small business participation, we saw a very significant increase in small business participation from the beginning, the first year, through the second year. It was a 380% increase in participation, from 179 small businesses to 859 in the second year. So one question is, why were the small businesses participating? What were they there for? What were they gaining? And so we asked them a series of questions about what they were looking for. They can, of course, answer a variety of different factors. Some of them being networking. About 80% said they were there for networking. 55% said access to cluster services. It ranged a gambit of different types of services they were providing. Again, some very customized to those businesses they were serving. Access to government procurement, about 49% indicated that. 35% said new markets. And about 30% said integration to the industry supply chain that they are in. 9 out of 10 of the clusters where their small businesses were participating, had increases in revenue. Again, remember the context. We're in the midst of an economic downturn. Whereas there was a 23% increase in revenue across the board. So this was a non-experimental study and an evaluation. So we didn't have a comparison group, but we did have benchmarks that we're able to get using a variety of different sources, including Dun & Bradstreet. So with respect to revenue, the Dun & Bradstreet, during that same time period for comparable types of businesses, was about 6.2% growth in revenue. And for 6 out of 10 of the 10 clusters, they exceeded the revenue growth as compared to our benchmark. Moving to employment. So for employment, on an annualized basis, the small businesses that were participating had about a 8.7% annualized improvement in employment. 13% of that was full-time employment, which again is important to distinguish between part-time and full-time. And comparing to that benchmark, it was about 2.3% using the quarterly census of employment and wages, and compared to the Dun & Bradstreet of 3.4%. So again, they were doing a lot better, again, the participants, small business participants, as compared to otherwise similar firms. Payroll, again, a number of the small businesses did better, 7 out of 10 of the clusters. And similarly on funding. And we didn't have a benchmark for funding, but there was significant amounts of funding that were generated in terms of outside funding from angel investors and others, from SBIR and STTR, and from, of course, contracts and subcontracts. 46% indicated that they improvements and increased engagement in the industry supply chain, as well as with patents. Now, I don't know if you want me to just a comment about the non-experimental drawbacks, just very quickly. Now, I did mention this was non-experimental, so we didn't have a comparison group. So our results are biased because, of course, the firms that would voluntarily participate they are better on average than just the other small businesses in their area, and so you might expect them to have better outcomes on the variety of metrics that I mentioned. And so in future evaluations, they're perhaps more rigorous. We'll be able to do comparisons perhaps on the firms that are participating to try and take account of that, what we call a self-selection bias, to get a better sense of what the actual causal impact is of cluster participation on the variety of metrics that I mentioned and more.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll give credit to SBA for inviting this work, right? They were.
Yes,
this was. What surprised you? I was sort of struck by, and maybe it's not surprising given the time period, but that there was there was immediate positive influences on jobs and other indicators. I've sort of viewed cluster strategy as a long-term strategy or a medium to long-term strategy. Do you think that those findings are coincidental with the period, or were you surprised by that?
Well, to the extent that we were in economic recession and there were potentially positive impacts, well, that speaks really to from a possibility that the participation is having a real impact, given the environment that was a serious economic downturn. And with respect to the time period, one of the things that we indicated that it would be hard to see an impact in the very short run. And so a lot of these things, in terms of if you're developing patents, well, those are going to produce jobs into the future. Right. And so to the extent that we're seeing those positive intermediate impacts, you would expect those to be even greater down the road.
Well, hopefully they'll continue to employ you to evaluate this experience over the next decade.